Hello, and welcome to Wise Concepts, where we dive into some of Wise's mechanics without doing any direct integrations. Today's episode is about using MIDI in Wise and how playing audio from MIDI information can be different than simply playing audio from a WAV file. Let's get to it. First thing, I'm going to show you what I'll be importing into Wise. I have three main assets. The first one is going to be this instrument track where I already am using a sound set to play the music. The next one is the same thing, except it is only playing a single note. We'll be using this track so Wise has an instrument to reference when reading the MIDI information, because keep in mind, MIDI does not inherently have sound. It's just information about what's being played, so that information needs to be able to drive an instrument before any sound can come through. Last, we have the actual MIDI information. It's the same melody as the one being played in the first track, so we'll be able to compare the two in Wise. Speaking of which, let's hop on over. The first thing I'm going to do is import my three assets. My full instrument and my MIDI file are both going to go into the interactive music hierarchy, while my single note instrument is going to go into my actor mixer hierarchy. Let's start with our instrument MIDI. There is a chance that, by default, you don't have the MIDI tab. If this is the case, then head over to the plus sign on the far right and select the tab that you want active. This could be useful for activating and deactivating certain tabs in order to keep your window clean and you can work more efficiently. Inside of the MIDI tab, we're going to add our single note instrument to the MIDI target. This is how we attach an instrument to the MIDI information, so we can hear the music, at least kind of. Let's press play and listen. If you like very minimalist music, then that might sound alright to you, but the instrument is clearly not following the notes that we set in the MIDI file. It's just detecting when each note is being played. Let's change that. Go over to our single note instrument and head into the MIDI tab. Go down to note tracking and hit the enable checkbox. You can set the root note to whatever you want, but I'm going to change mine to C5. Now let's go back to our instrument MIDI and press play again. That sounds more like it should. Now let's compare it to our full instrument. So as you would expect, the instrument that we made in Pro Tools is a lot cleaner. The DAW and Soundset have ways of making each note flow into each other more smoothly, while the MIDI is simply working with the one single note that we gave it. So other than MIDI information being far smaller in file size than your average WAV file, why would we want to use MIDI over waves for your DAW? Well, MIDI allows you to be a little more malleable in your game project. One example of this is how MIDI handles tempo changes. In order to demonstrate this, let's make a new RTPC. Go to the Game Syncs tab and add a new game parameter. I'm going to name mine Tempo. Leave this game parameter at its defaults, then let's head back to the Audio tab. We're going to go into our instrument MIDI and head into the RTPC tab. For the Y-axis, we're going to add in the playback speed. This is going to act as our tempo since we don't have the ability to affect the actual tempo through RTPCs. For the X-axis, we're going to add in our tempo RTPC. You can change this however you like, but I'm going to move the point on the right side to 1.5. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing to my full instrument. Playback speed on the Y-axis and the tempo gain parameter on the X-axis, and moving the rightmost point to 1.5. Let's see how changing the playback speed affects the sound. In this case, it affects both the tempo of the music, but also the music's pitch. Now let's hear how the playback speed affects the sound of our MIDI. This time, it only affected the tempo without adjusting the pitch. Great! We have now played around with our MIDI, but it doesn't sound amazing. However, we don't have to just use an instrument from our DAW to attach to our MIDI. Wise has a couple of other functions to add instruments that aren't coming from an outside source. In this case, we're going to use Wise Synth 1. First, we're going to make a new sound SFX in the actor mixer hierarchy, which I'm going to name Square Wave. Right now, Square Wave is red because there are no sounds attached to it. In order to add to it, we're going to go into the Square Waves Contents Editor and hit the Add Source button in the top right corner. From the resulting drop-down menu, we're going to select Wise Synth 1. Double-click the plug icon on the left side to go into the Synth 1 settings. From here, you can edit the synth however you like, but for now, I'm just going to change the waveform in both oscillators to square. X out of the window and make sure to set the frequency mode to MIDI notes. This is how we ensure that the synth will follow along with our MIDI. Great! Our new instrument is now all set up. Let's head back to the instrument MIDI and head back into the MIDI tab. Instead of playing the single note instrument, we're going to switch the target to our new square wave. Let's hear what that sounds like. That sounds alright. Now, let's get a little silly to really demonstrate what other fun things you can do with your MIDI. So far, the last two instruments have demonstrated more practical melodic functions of MIDI, but any sound effect is free game. So I'm going to import a voiceover I did for a previous episode, and adjust its wavelength so that it's only playing a short syllable. Don't forget, head into the MIDI tab and enable note tracking. One more time, head back to the MIDI tab of our instrument MIDI, and I'm going to add in my new voiceover SFX. Let's hear how that sounds. Absolutely horrifying, but it's one of the many things that you can do with your MIDI. So far in the last two parts, we've only been using the same instrument tone for every single note. The MIDI information is the only thing that's changing the pitch of the instrument. So how do we go about making so that each note has its own unique instrument tone? We do that by using the MIDI tab's key map editor. We're going to start with a blend container in the actor mixer hierarchy, which I'm going to name Sampler. For the purpose of demonstration, I'm going to copy and paste the instrument's single note 10 times into this blend container. For each one, I'm going to add 100 to the pitch all the way up to 900 on the top. Go back to our sampler blend container and head to the MIDI tab. Hit the key map editor button. From here, we're going to need to do a few things. First, hit the checkbox to override MIDI note tracking for all of our sound effects. Then, enable MIDI note tracking for all the sound effects as well. The first thing I'm going to edit is my MIDI tracking root note. All of these will be the notes that I know are in my MIDI file. Something to note, Wise only allows you to add sharps, not flats. So even though I'd like to add E flat for my C minor scale, I'll have to settle with D sharp instead. Now I'm going to change all my key range mins and key range maxes so that they are the same as our MIDI tracking root notes. Make sure you are only editing your sound effects, not the blend container itself. And that's all you have to do with your blend container. Just like with your previous instruments, we need to attach it to our MIDI. Go back to the MIDI tab in the instrument MIDI and change the target to our new blend container. Let's hear how that sounds. Very strange, but it is for demonstration after all. Don't be afraid to get creative. You really can do a lot with MIDI. That's it for this video. Check out the Google Doc below for reference material that was used in researching this video. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, compose a comment below or message me at my Twitter, @KaraComposer. This video series is driven by community support, so if there's something you would like to see in a future video, do not be afraid to ask. Otherwise, I'll see you all in the next video.